Good morning, and actually good afternoon to everybody who's joining today. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund in the United States, also the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, we want to welcome you to today's event. We're going to be focusing on the second round of Poland's presidential election, which is an incredibly tight race. I want to thank everybody for joining us on both sides of the Atlantic. For this conversation, we are really lucky to have two amazing speakers and my colleague who runs GMF's Warsaw office. GMF obviously has a great deal of interest, including an office in Warsaw. And so this particular event is timely, and deeply appreciate our participants today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I also direct GMF's Frontlines of Democracy initiative. And I'm really proud to be here today. I appreciate my co-moderator, Susan Corke, who's also not only a fellow at GMF, a colleague, but also is one of the leaders and actually the directors of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group here in Washington, D.C. So let's just get started. And of course, just rules of the Zoom event. You guys are going to only see the speakers. The speakers won't see you today. There's a Q&A function on Zoom. We ask that you provide those questions. You can pose them at any point during the event, but we'll have a special session point after our speakers give their introductions, which to answer those questions. And Susan will be moderating that part of the event. So just starting us off, as I mentioned, Poland's presidential election is about to head into its second round of voting in just a couple of short days. The first round, which I know our speakers are going to discuss, had a number of candidates. Of course, the incumbent President Duda came out on top with the largest percentage of vote. In second place is the mayor of Warsaw. And as we were looking at, and I think they'll go more deeply into this, as we look at polling numbers, we're seeing a real tightening of the race. We'll get more into that. But from the transatlantic perspective, obviously there's a great deal of interest, not only in what happens domestically, but also how outcome of this election will impact Poland's relationship with the United States, with the EU, and what will this mean for the trends that we've seen in Poland? Is it a shift in terms of democracy? Will be shifts in terms of relationships within the EU? We have experts here who are steeped in what's taking place. So I want to just bring them in. As I mentioned, we have Michał Baranowski, who's the director of GMF's Warsaw office. Michał, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us today. We also have Michał Szułdrzyński. And I just want to thank you for being here, who's deputy, I think the deputy chief editor of Rzeczpospolita, if I did okay pronouncing that. And thank you so much for being here. You're an expert on, and we're going to start with you first. Your focus on Poland's domestic political scene. I've followed you in terms of a number of things that you've been writing about. I don't think anybody is as keen an observer of domestic trends in politics in Poland. And what I wanted to do was to reach out to you first, to have you kick us off. Last couple of weeks, actually it's the last several weeks, when the government tried to move a presidential election forward in May, where there was a tremendous amount of opposition. We haven't even touched on COVID-19 and the impact domestically and politically, but a lot has shifted in Poland in only a short few months from where we were earlier this year to where we are today. There's a number of different domestic trends. Some are issue-related values. Some are sort of historic issues. There's nothing dull at all when you talk about Polish politics. They seem as hot as the summer is today. And so we're really interested to hear from you, to hear more about where you see this election going in the final days, what's taken place. And I think one of the things is that some of us have been following this for a number of months now. For others that haven't, maybe if you could just start us off too to tell us a little bit about how we got to that first round, the numbers, and then bring us up to speed to where we are today. So for this, we're just going to say Michał S and Michał B, just so we don't confuse anybody. And Michał S, can I turn it over to you to kick us off? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that I have to thank for this invitation. It's really a pleasure and honor to take part in it and to say some words. We have many paradoxes in this election. As you mentioned, due to the Constitution, election should have happened on 10th of May, but it didn't happen because it didn't happen, because it couldn't be held during the coronavirus pandemic. And after that, all the major political powers agreed that another date, 28th of June, and second round, 12th of July, will be this date. The second paradox is that we have two candidates who have the chance, and both of them are paradoxically quite similar. Both of them are 48 years old. Both of them held a PhD. Incumbent President Andrzej Duda, he's a PhD on law, and Rafał Trzaskowski, Mayor of Warsaw, he holds his PhD on European relations and political sciences. They both were born in two biggest Polish cities, one in Krakow, one in Warsaw. And both of them are not politicians from the very beginning. They became politicians being an expert before. But they are in completely different points of the political scene. And I can say that we have this huge battle between, or huge competition between, as I call it, romantic conservative camp, I mean ruling party, Law and Justice and President Duda, and progressive central liberal camp, Mr. Trzaskowski and his civic platform, the former Donald Tusk party, in which Mr. Trzaskowski is a deputy chairman. And we had a first round. In first round, I don't want you to bother you with numbers, but President Duda received 8.5 million votes, and Mr. Trzaskowski received almost 6 million votes. Providing the turnout in the second round is the same as in the first, you will need 10 million votes to become a president, to win the election. It means Mr. Duda needs 1.5 million and Mr. Trzaskowski needs 4 million votes. But paradoxically, it's easier for Trzaskowski to gain the rest than to Mr. Duda, because Poland is quite polarized. Although there were 11 candidates, only 6 of them count in this race. And if you count the votes from, let's say, anti-ruling party camp, there are 9 million voters. And if you have Mr. Duda, you have 8.5 million votes. So you need 1 million left. And this 1 million, exactly 1.3 million votes. It is far-right Confederacja, which is right to the ruling party, but they didn't support, they supported neither Mr. Duda nor Mr. Trzaskowski. So it's not easy to say whom they will support on Sunday. What will decide on this result? Today the polls are really, really close. We have neck-to-neck race. In one poll, one poll says that Mr. Trzaskowski wins at 51% to 49, and other says that he loses 49 to 51 and Mr. Duda is winning. So nobody knows, and all depends on the turnout, and all depends on which groups of electorate will go to the polling stations on Sunday. I would give you one very important example. I told you that you need 10 million votes to win. We have 9 million voters in the group 60 plus, so the so-called seniors. And this is the group which was in which the turnout was very, very small in the first round. 1 million less people from this group voted in the first round, comparing last election in autumn. It means there are almost 1 million people who are afraid of coronavirus, because people in the age of 60 plus are the most vulnerable. So I think that this group will be the most important for the final result. And even if we have the result, it will be neck to neck, and I think it could be 400,000 votes, the difference, or even 100,000 votes. I mean, that means it is 0.5%. And what is the stake of this race? If Mr. Duda wins, it means that we have huge stabilization, because the next election is 2023. So ruling party, right-wing ruling party, will have 3.5 years of stability and having all the power in the country, not mentioning Supreme Court, but Constitutional Tribunal, and all other powers in the state. Or when Mr. Trzaskowski wins, it means that we are having so-called cohabitation. The ruling party will have majority in the lower chamber of the parliament, but the opposition will have its president and the majority in the Senate. It means that we will have sort of checks and balances system, in which president in Polish constitution has not too much positive power, but he has very strong veto, and ruling party, I mean Law and Justice, and Mr. Duda's, which supports Mr. Duda, doesn't have the majority enough to overthrow the veto of the president. So it will be much more difficult for ruling party to rule autonomously, and they will have to count and make some concessions for president to each time they will have to persuade him and ask him for his signature to pass any legislation in Poland. And last but not least, but I would like to also say that what is the reason that the ruling party has so much support now? Because Mr. Trzaskowski, Mr. Duda received 43.5% of all votes, and it is the same result as Law and Justice received in October in parliamentary election, and it is the highest. Result that political party in Poland ever received after the fall of communism in 1989. And reason, I think that there are two reasons. First reason is of economical nature. I think it is huge social transfers, huge redistribution, which gave a lot of the many groups of people the feeling that they matter, because these are the groups which didn't perceive themselves as the victims of the process of transformation from communism to free market economy. And there were many people, and all the governments were focusing after 1989. They were focusing rather in investitions in building infrastructure and this party, I mean, ruling party, they decided to switch this stream of money, not to hard infrastructure, but to the people bank accounts. There were many programs like bonuses for children. There are very costing, very expensive for the state budget programs like 13th pension. Every people who are on retirement, they received 13th, not only once a month, but they received extra bonus from the government in May. It is called 13th retirement, state pension. You have huge help for families with children, and this is the first point. And it has huge political impact. I will give you two numbers. The pollsters asked polls in 2013, do they personally feel that they have any importance for that what's happening in the state, in the country? Do they feel that they participate in what's happening in the country? Do they have any influence on what's happening? And in 2013, 80% of polls say, no, we have no influence into what's happening in the country. Now it is 58%. And in 2013, only 19% said, yes, we have an influence on what's happening in the country. And now it is over 40. So it shows that this transfer of money made many people in the society feel that they are important, that they are subjective, that they count in the state, and it is generally people who have children who receive money from the government, and it is people it is the seniors. Okay, I don't want to talk any longer. I hope that it's a little landscape that will help you to get what's happening here.
Definitely. Thank you. And I think you raised a number of issues. I know that there will be some additional follow-up questions, but I wanted to turn to my colleague, Michał Baranowski, just to pick up on, there's obviously the domestic side, which was just beautifully laid out in terms of key issues that could impact the upcoming vote in just a couple of days domestically, and sort of what's been driving the Polish public in terms of, and citizens and voters in terms of what they want. But can we just turn a little bit to the foreign policy side and implications? Obviously, there's been a very aggressive effort by this particular government. President Duda was in Washington just a few days before the first round of the election in June, which is a bit unprecedented in terms of a foreign leader coming to Washington right before an election. But there's also been an effort to court President Trump. On the opposite side, the EU, Brussels, has had a particularly challenging time with this current government, concerns about democratic backsliding, other issues as well. There's also regional and other issues. Can you just speak to these implications, how this factors into Polish voters, and obviously there's historic issues, and just like in the United States, for the most part, people vote on their pocketbook issues, which Michał S. just spoke about, which seems to be things that really impact people's their day-to-day lives. But can you speak to these larger issues? And certainly for those of us who are sort of joining from Washington and across Europe, we want to it'd be great to get your assessment and a better understanding of how these factors are playing out, but how they could be impacted. So over to you.
Absolutely. It's fantastic to be with you, Jonathan, Susan, Michał, and all of the friends and colleagues on the other side of the camera, mostly in Washington, D.C. As Michał Szułdrzyński mentioned, we are in a very polarized moment in Polish history, in Polish public life. Many people talk about this election as really a fork on the road. Given that on one hand you have stability, as Michał mentioned, and continuity of law and justice government with President Duda, this also is a fork in the road when it comes to tendencies of Poland when it comes to foreign policy. Let me go into deeper aspect of it. So it's good to know for those who don't necessarily follow Poland every day that Polish president in our system is, unlike in the United States, less powerful, of course, but he plays an important role in foreign and defense policy. It's the president, for example, that represents Poland at NATO summits. But in this case, given that even with the win of Trzaskowski over President Duda, the government would still be in the driving seat when it comes to the content of the foreign policy. But of course, how it's communicated would make an important difference. So it does matter. Now, one question that I very much observed during this election campaign was, to what extent did foreign policy play a role? And interestingly, or maybe not interestingly at all, foreign policy as policy didn't play any real role. It wasn't that President Duda and Mayor Trzaskowski, or President Trzaskowski, because he's a president of Warsaw, were comparing their visions of Poland's foreign policy. It wasn't that. But at the same time, foreign policy as identity play an important role. And in fact, surprisingly important role. So as Jonathan, as you mentioned, President Duda went to Washington, D.C. just 4 days before the election for a first visit after the pandemic, well, really during the pandemic, but as the first foreign leaders visiting President Trump, to show how strong Polish-American relations are and how much it's thanks to him personally. There were very high expectations of this visit in terms of real outcomes, and those outcomes did not materialize, but nonetheless, it was something that was playing very strongly in the news. And it goes to show how important US is, that Mayor Trzaskowski, President Trzaskowski, then reached out to President Obama to connect with Obama to really show that he also has good friends in Washington, and perhaps to show that he would be in good contacts in case Vice President Biden wins in the United States. The other message probably is a little bit that support for more bipartisan view of Polish-American relations, but nonetheless, sort of one camp showed proximity to Republicans and the other one to Democratic campaign. So the U.S. played in this identity role. The other country that played and keeps playing actually as we speak very strongly is Germany, and it played out a few times, but we are right now in the midst of a, I would say, pretty ugly situation, and it would take a long time to explain it. But so let me just grab the very end of it, where the Polish MFA, for example, was just called the charge d'affaires of the German embassy to explain why newspapers that have part German ownership print articles that are negative of President Duda. And President Duda very strongly himself said that it shouldn't be Germany who chooses our president. So there is a clear animosity or rhetorical attack that is coming out because that resonates. Something that hasn't been present as much is European Union, even though that's comparatively possibly more important. Just in very broad general terms, Trzaskowski emphasizes his pro-European credentials. On the other hand, Prime Minister Morawiecki, along with President Duda, emphasized that the recovery fund that European Union is preparing would benefit Poland substantially. So there is both sides are trying to show their proximity to Europe, but not necessarily in the same sense. Certainly with very little love when to Brussels itself coming from President Duda and the campaign. Maybe for the last minute, so again, identity rather than policies, but again, that's something that resonates and that we frankly see also in the results of parliamentary campaign. So maybe in the last minute, because I know that I'm already speaking for a few, just for, what would presidency of President Duda or presidency of President Trzaskowski mean for Polish foreign policy? For President Duda, I think that's a little bit easier because we would have a large amount of continuation. I would expect a further bilateralization and strengthening of the Polish-American relations, bilateralization in a way of taking the security relationship more in a bilateral terms versus operating this within NATO. We can come back to this. It's a bit of a wonky distinction, but I think important nonetheless. I would expect some pragmatism, certainly comparing to the rhetorics now toward Germany, but I think there'll be increasing difficulties from the German side. And of course, the big question is what happens at the EU level, with now Poland being the biggest non-Eurozone member, with the UK floating away and needing to find new alliances and allies. For Trzaskowski, let me just outline it really quickly. I would expect a reprioritization when it comes to the US and EU. EU up, US down, and Germany somewhere up there as well. Second point would be warming, let's say, relations with both Germany and France that have been strained. Third, prioritization of NATO over bilateral relations when it comes to security and defense cooperation. Again, no one would throw out what has been accomplished, but I think there will be an emphasis on this. And of course, some efforts to reestablish relations with Russia. I'll stop here. I think one of the important things for us to discuss is also how you are in the midst, Americans, you are in the midst of your campaign. So we should also talk a little bit about how potential Trump 2.0 or what second term of Trump versus Biden's presidency and his administration would look toward Poland. I have some thoughts on this, but let's do it in the second part. Thanks.
Great. Michał, thank you for that too. And I think this begs the question to have another event at another time to talk about sort of how U.S. policy, foreign policy, particularly in relation to Poland, will fare depending on who wins in November. But I want to thank you first for that both the presentation, sort of reminding people about how presidential power is different in Poland versus the United States. That there was also this additional call that took place between the mayor of Warsaw and President Obama, and that there's these issues of polarization internally are driving certain factors, but also that even relationships with Germany play a role between various candidates internally. And that makes a tremendous amount of sense. We didn't get a chance to talk a lot about the impact of Russia in this political context, but I think all those things are really important. And I think what we want to do now is, and I see a number of people have already weighed in with questions. Please feel free right now, if you haven't done so, to draft questions, send it in. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Susan Corke, in Washington to lead the Q&A session. And thank you again to both of our speakers. Susan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michał B. and Michał S. As I'll refer to both of you as we go to questions, both of you for a brilliant analysis and insights into what's at stake domestically and why this election is getting so much attention beyond Poland, because it is seen as consequential for Europe and the United States. I think where Michał left off is something I wanted to comment on quickly as well. For the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, Poland has really been a priority for us because it's such an important ally for the United States, yet it's been pursuing what many have said is an anti-democratic path and has been, in a turbulent relationship, I guess I'd say, with the EU. And so the media attention in the United States has been very dramatic, the two bitter rivals heading for a razor's edge presidential runoff election on Sunday. Both of you talked about how the elephant in the voters' booth has been Washington, with both candidates banking that show of Washington support was very consequential. And it's also been seen as a test case on many fronts, as both of you talked about, for Poland's democratic future within the EU and with the US. The Transatlantic Democracy Working Group had been following it very closely as to see how Poland was really a test case for how a country navigated being a democracy during a pandemic. There's also the elements of the rural-urban divide. I also think that it's getting so much attention in the United States because we have a lot of, our elections are covering a lot of those same themes. So Michał, you left off by saying that this is also, by gambling, that the United States plays a big role, that President Trump has very much been establishing a bilateral relationship with Poland, which is at odds with the NATO framework, versus we would expect that Biden would return back more to a multilateral path. Could you talk a little bit about, you said that shows that there's foreign policy plays a role, but how have you seen that playing out in the electorate? Is that something that is being discussed? I'll turn that to Michał B.
Thanks, Susan. Let me first say that I don't think that necessarily Poland having a strong bilateral relationship with the US is at odds with having a good relationship with other NATO member states. This has been really for the last 30 years a point of consensus in Poland that Poland needs to have a strong relationship with US, with Europe, with EU and NATO member states. I think the question here, and the thing that I worry a little bit more about, is that the relations with the US are become more of a partisan issue, both in the US and in Poland. In the US, as Jonathan mentioned, it's very unusual for a president of the United States to see someone who is running for elections in a democracy, in competitive elections, only 4 days before the election itself. It really is comparable only to the situation with Bibi Netanyahu. And I would, so as a citizen, I would question whether we want to have, as Poland, relationship with President Trump or with the United States, and more broadly. So I think here the work that will need to be done, actually by whoever wins on Sunday, will be to make sure that the relationship is bipartisan, that there is a reach out to Congress, and that there is a reach out to the Biden's campaign, which, as everyone on the screen, behind the camera knows, that this is very competitive race, to say the least, in the US. But it also became a little bit more of partisan issue in Poland because President Trump seemed to embrace one of the candidates so closely. And there was a criticism of this. I would not expect that a win of Mayor Trzaskowski would mean somehow a breakdown of the relationship. This relationship is too important for our national interest. But it's hard to avoid an impression that the relationship between Trzaskowski and Biden might be a closer one than between Trzaskowski and Trump or between Biden and President Duda because of all the issues that have been piling up. So I think that's where I would put the emphasis on, and there is a NATO component to this. But it's as long as Poland is not seen as benefiting from a spat, for example, between US and Germany. And to his credit, President Duda, while in Washington, said that Poland does not want to see US pull out from Germany. That's what he said very much on the record. As long as we avoid the impression that we are somehow benefiting from bad relations between US and other NATO members, I think we are fine. But I think that's a line that is important to maintain. Thanks.
That is very important, and thank you for emphasizing that. That's regardless of who wins the Polish election, Poland will remain an important US ally, and there's a number of people from the Hill who are online, and I think there are ones who are concerned with having it be a bipartisan issue, and I think you were wise to make the point that it's dangerous if it becomes too personalized, that it is about the US-Poland relationship. I have one question for Michał S., and then I want to turn, there's a lot of audience questions that I'll turn to. The first round of the election, the virus played a really big role in the election. Can you talk a little bit about how those fears have been navigated and how Poland has operated in the second round? And then a second question is, after President Duda had very much wanted to had tried to have it in the first round, and the Trzaskowski coming up as the opposition candidate was very much unexpected. Duda has seemed to switch his tactics and has been resorting more to fear-mongering. The visit to the White House was seen as kind of a desperate move. Is this strategy working for him? And to what extent is he shifting tactics due to the pandemic?
First of all, to those who are not familiar with the situation of coronavirus in Poland, we have so far registered 36,000 cases for 40 million population. We have 1,500 deaths from coronavirus from the very beginning, and the average of new cases it's 200 a day, sometimes 250. So we cannot say we have no problem with that, but comparing many states in the world, the situation is under control. We have quite strong lockdown in Poland. We had in March and April, but sanctions were lifted on May and June. And as you go to the street, you don't see that for many people it is still an issue. People, for example, unfortunately do not obey there is regulation which orders everybody who cannot preserve social distance to wear face mask in, for example, bus, train, or public transportation, or in lifts, or in some places. But it matters for elderly people, and also it matters for economy. But yesterday, European Commission presented a forecast of GDP growth, and the Poland's GDP growth is the best in the whole EU. We will have -4 this year, comparing -10 of Spain and -9 by Greece. And in 2021, the prediction is that we will have +4, which will be the highest rate in EU. So it is fortunately or unfortunately, it turned out that these sectors of the economy, which suffer coronavirus the most, especially tourism, has not a big impact on Polish GDP. And this, I don't think it will be the most important thing during this, the most important issue during this election. Rather, this what Michał Baranowski calls identity. Yes, this political alternative, whether we should go more in liberal democracy type, more liberal values presented by Mr. Trzaskowski, or should we stay with this idea of so-called a liberal democracy, very huge emphasis of patriotic and religious values in the public life presented by ruling party now. To the second question, as I understand it, it's yes, Trzaskowski came to the game at the very end because he became a candidate in beginning of June, and his strategy is quite interesting because he's trying to show the alternative for those who are fed up with this polarization of Polish society. Of course, he doesn't. He's the member of this camp from the other side to the ruling party, but in many his speeches, in many interviews, he's trying to show that he will be the one who will restore the belief in democracy, the belief in the trusts of social trust, and he's trying to show that this election is one of the most important elections in last 30 years. What Duda is saying is telling people, listen, people, you had very good 5 years. You had huge economical growth. The pandemic is something we couldn't predict. But give us another 5 years, and you will still have, you will be well off, and your income will be good. Situation is safe, and do not talk about such a abstracted things like liberal democracy or freedom of speech or independence of judiciary system.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to some audience questions. George Zock has had several, so I'm going to combine two of his into one. Said, how and how much has the impact of young voters changed since 2015? And what is the role of young voters in the current election? And second, is President Duda's position on LGBTQ likely to have a big impact in the runoff election? As we just mentioned, he's certainly gambled that it will. And with what voting group will that make the biggest difference?
This question about younger voters is really interesting because in 2015, Andrzej Duda won in every fraction of age. In all groups, Andrzej Duda won. And in the first round, Andrzej Duda was fourth in the youngest electorate, between 18 and from 18 to 29. He was fourth, and it shows something that the younger electorate is changing. The problem is that paradoxically, this government is helping families with children and people who is in retirement, but doesn't have as regards social transfers, doesn't have a lot to propose to young people, except for some tax helps for people under 26. So it is something which is striking in this campaign. And as regards LGBT, I do not think it will harm Mr. Duda support, especially that yesterday Mr. Duda tabled the project of amendment to the constitution, which bans same-sex couples on adoptions. So Polish law doesn't recognize same-sex partnerships, civil partnerships, nor marriages. So it's invisible through from the point of view from Polish legal system. Paradoxically, making this ban part of the constitution will enter this entity like same-sex marriage to our constitution. So from one perspective, it is part of his conservative agenda, but paradoxically, it enters the notion of same-sex couple to our legal system.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to turn to Michał B. with a question from Johannes Elfeit. How does EU policy feature in the campaign, and how does the economic downturn during the coronavirus crisis affect the trust by the people in the current government?
Yeah, and I would love to, I think this is something that I would love to hear also from Michał Szułdrzyński on, because I don't think there is a single answer to this. I mean, I'm a little bit surprised that it doesn't feature more than what we are seeing it right now. I could imagine, for example, given the importance of Poland's membership in the EU, both in terms of identity, in terms of economy, in terms of the historical moment that we have been going through in the EU for a while, that it would be more of an issue. Also, given that one of the candidates in this case, Mayor Trzaskowski, has quite a bit of an experience. He was a deputy of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs dealing with European affairs, but it hasn't been a huge issue. It was. I would still see it more in identity questions rather than real policy. You know, whether you have behind you when you speak both European and Polish flags, or if it's only Polish flags, whether you talk about strong Poland in strong Europe, or whether you talk mostly about strong Poland. One area where it really became a little bit more clear was when after Macron and Merkel came out with their initial plan, and then European Commission came out with a proposal, all of a sudden it appeared that Poland can benefit quite a bit in financial terms from the European Recovery Fund. And that's something that was actually picked up more by the government, and therefore also by the president. But as Michał Szułdrzyński mentioned, this is, we are in a very different moment of the pandemic than many of you on the other side of the pond. The feeling is, even though it's not fully justified, but the numbers are by far better, but the feeling is that this is largely over, and that the impact wasn't nearly as severe as we worried, and certainly not as severe as many other places. So the pandemic also is not playing a huge issue in the campaign, either for or against President Duda, I would say. But Michał, maybe you have different views also on the EU.
Thank you. I was really surprised that foreign policy as such and European relations played such a small role in this campaign. I thought that Rafał Trzaskowski would like to benefit from his past as a expert on EU constitution. It is his scientific field of interest. He was for many years a lecturer in College of European College, which is in Warsaw, which is a place in when many EU staffers are taking the education. But I think that he was afraid of one thing we didn't mention, because this campaign is also showing huge divisions in Polish society. On one side, you have Trzaskowski and Civic Platform with the support of huge cities, but you have 40% of Poles, or 30% of Poles living in huge cities, 20 to 30 living in rural areas, and other living in small towns. So this Mr. Duda tried to make this campaign, this discussion, whose Poland is. Is it owned by elites or by every people? I told you about this polls showing how people now see that they have influence on what's happening. So it was something where Trzaskowski is really trying to avoid, to showing him as an expert, as a white collar, as a person from big city, having some European experience, to avoid this division that he's a representative of elites, celebrities, and he's not. He has no idea how to deal with the problems of a simple man.
That's very consequential when it's framed in those terms, in terms of identity and whose Poland is it. I'm going to turn next to our GMF colleague, Thomas Klein-Brockhoff, who has the following question. If the election is as close as predicted, could it be challenged American style? Are there legal and constitutional instruments to do that? And can the election be called free and fair given government control of electronic media? Start with you.
Yeah. Due to the Polish constitution, due to the Polish law, it is the Supreme Court who says whether election is valid or not. So it will be some Supreme Court who will have the final decision about it. And as I understand the phrase American-like, it means that if it is so close, maybe somebody will appeal and say, okay, well, let's count it once more. And let's count how many people were couldn't vote for many reasons. How did it have any impact on the final result? And yes, I wrote a piece yesterday in Rzeczpospolita saying that it will be the third round of our elections. I mean the Supreme Court. As regards, can we call it free? For example, some international institutions criticize the role of public media, which are not unbiased, and they are not fully objective, and they are really partisan. But you have still a variety of private outlets and private media in Poland, and you have really wide range of points of views and then political spectrum in it. So if we note this problem of public media, especially public television, I think that we have free discussion on what's happening, and from this formal point, I don't find any reason to say that this election was not free nor fair.
Let me jump in on this because Office of the Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, part of the OSCE, already issued their opinion about the first round, and this is in fact exactly as Michał Szułdrzyński pointed out, emphasized the oversized role of the public media and the lack of impartiality. And for those who have pleasure of watching the media news, especially, it is pretty clear that it's not impartial. And I think, yeah. Anyways, I'm not going to compare it to American TVs, but it's pretty out there. And others could argue, well, some of the private media are not entirely impartial either, which is probably the case. But that does not, of course, excuse the public media because they are paid by taxpayers' money, and they are really not. The media itself, I would say, are not seen as legitimate anymore. But I don't think that this would translate into the whole process being seen as illegitimate. I was worried very much, for example, about legitimacy of this election when we were planning to vote on May 10th. I think if we had elections taking place on May 10th, we would have a real crisis of legitimacy in Poland. But the feeling is now very different. And it's a very real campaign. I mean, we really don't know who's going to win on Sunday. So we have multiple fingers pressing on the scale. But I think one thing that we managed to avoid is this crisis of legitimacy, which would be devastating for Polish democracy. But I really don't think it's the case this time around.
Yeah, I think I agree with you and with both of you that in the second round, you know, with the numbers for the coronavirus going down, that it has been less of a priority issue. We're coming up on our final minute. So I'm gonna talk, there's one final question that I think is a good way to have you both frame your closing remarks or comment on anything you'd like to. It's from Justin Daniels. Could you predict the impact that each candidate's victory would have for the state of Polish democracy and democratic institutions? And then feel free to add any of your own commentary in 1 minute each, please.
And the Minister the Justice Ministry of Poland said that when we win election, we'll have to make order with media. So when I'm listening to such a promise, I'm a bit thrilled and afraid. What does he mean to make order with media? Especially that the private media now are the warrant of free speech in Poland. And of course, when Andrzej Duda wins, the ruling party will continue its really controversial judiciary reform, which isn't reform in fact, because Poles are really disappointed in what's happening in courts, and everybody wants changes, but these changes didn't help the judiciary system to work better. But it made the influence of politicians on courts bigger. So in this terms, it's not a reform, but it's something which is spoiling our system, in my opinion. So I don't think it will be much worse than it is today. But the ruling party will have 3.5 years free hand to do anything what they want. If Rafał Trzaskowski wins, the situation is completely different because President, as I told, has a strong veto, and he can veto many things. And if he wins, he will have only 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, he will become a president because due to the coronavirus, the election should be 3 months before the expiry date of the term of the president of his tenure. But it finishes at 5th of August, so the ruling party will have very little time to change anything or to pass some controversial legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michał B?
I would say what happens in Poland doesn't stay in Poland. I heard it. It's not mine. I stole it from someone. I don't remember who, but it's a good one. And I really think that in this sense, watching the presidential election in Poland makes sense for people that care about Europe, care about transatlantic relations, because Poland has been a bit of a trendsetter also in the past. So of course the win for President Duda, just as Michał Szułdrzyński said, will be the continuation of the trend, and whether you like it or not, there will be 3.5 years of doing more of the same. There are also, I would remind our friends, of course this will have consequences for the region and for the EU, and I would remind our friends on the other side of the Atlantic that the elections in Poland came soon before elections in the United States. So we were in a way first. So I would say watch the space, and I would say it's a pretty decent predictor given how both of our societies are polarized. We live in the same bubbles. We have lots of similar issues with the US, strange as it is. And I think someday is a decent predictor of what happens on your side of the pond in November. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was a good conclusion, both of you, to a really fascinating discussion. And we will stay tuned, and we are now all better informed. So thank you both so much. I'll turn it back to my co-host, Jonathan. Really appreciate
Susan, thank you. And thank you for those brilliant remarks, and also answers to a number of really important questions. And so, you know, what takes place in Poland also is taking place here. So we're certainly watching what will take place. And I think Susan emphasized the great interest in this election, particularly in Washington, also in Brussels and elsewhere. And so we wish you good luck in the next couple of days as you're sort of following what's taking place and what may come after. So on behalf of the German Marshall Fund in the United States, TDWG as well, my colleague Susan and I here in Washington, we want to thank you to both of our speakers, are brilliant speakers, but also to those that have participated. And we look forward to finding out the results of what happens on Sunday. So we'll be staying tuned. And Michał S., I'll be looking forward to your next updates and what you're writing, and my colleague in GMF's Warsaw office too. And hopefully we can put together the next panel, which will be getting our US speakers here too, to talk about how the US election is going to impact the relationship with Poland, but also in the region. And a lot to chew on. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience again. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll hope to see you soon. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.